When Teyana Taylor finally broke her silence, the reaction wasn't immediate applause or outrage. It was pause. Because for the first time since the quiet end of her relationship with Pierre, she chose to explain her side without theatrics. No rant, no blame, just a carefully worded statement that shifted the entire conversation. People expected drama. What they got instead was perspective, and that made the moment feel heavier than any viral clip. Let's be clear from the start. This is not about confirmed wrongdoing or proven betrayal. It is about what Teyana said publicly, how she framed her experience, and why the word betrayal immediately took over headlines even though no specific act was detailed. She spoke about trust changing, about discovering things after the fact, and about realizing that the version of the relationship she believed in was not fully shared. That framing alone was enough to send the internet into interpretation mode. According to Teyana, the decision to leave was not sudden. It was the result of processing moments that only made sense in hindsight. She did not accuse Pierre of a crime or public scandal. She described emotional misalignment and private disappointment, leaving listeners to decide how severe that sounded. Social media reacted instantly, turning reflection into revelation and nuance into certainty. Some praised her honesty, others questioned timing, but once she spoke, silence was no longer the loudest part of the story. The shocking element wasn't what she revealed. It was that she revealed just enough to change perception forever, without ever spelling out a single detail. This moment doesn't close the story, it reframes it. And once a breakup is reframed through betrayal, even implied, the audience stops asking what happened and starts deciding who they believe long after the relationship ends. To understand why Teyana's words carried so much weight, you have to look at how long she chose not to speak. For weeks after the breakup with Pierre, there was no explanation from her side. No clarification, no emotional posts, no attempt to shape the narrative. In celebrity culture, that kind of restraint is rare, and when it finally breaks, people assume something important must have happened in the background. Silence creates expectation, and expectation magnifies impact. When Teyana Taylor finally addressed the situation, she didn't describe a dramatic incident or point to a single moment that ended everything. Instead, she talked about realization. She spoke about understanding things later that she didn't fully grasp while she was still emotionally invested. That distinction matters because it shifts the conversation away from public events and toward private processing. The betrayal, as she framed it, was not something that happened loudly. It was something that became clear quietly. The word betrayal entered the headlines not because she used it aggressively, but because media outlets needed a hook that would capture attention. Her language was measured, but interpretation was not. In online spaces, emotional honesty often gets compressed into extreme conclusions. What she described as misalignment and broken trust was quickly reframed as something darker and more intentional. That reframing traveled faster than the original context ever could. Public reaction followed a familiar split. Some listeners felt her explanation added necessary balance to a story that had leaned heavily on interpretation. Others felt the lack of specifics invited unfair assumptions about Aaron's character. Both reactions existed at the same time, and neither required proof. Once someone explains why they left a relationship, the audience feels licensed to judge the relationship itself, even though they were never part of it. Another factor that amplified the response was relatability. Many people have experienced moments where a relationship only made sense after it ended. Hearing Teyana articulate that feeling resonated with listeners who had lived through similar realizations. That emotional connection made her words feel truthful, even though truth and completeness are not the same thing. Empathy filled in gaps that facts did not. What made this phase especially delicate is that Teyana did not position herself as a victim of a specific act. She positioned herself as someone who chose to leave after recognizing a deeper mismatch in trust and understanding. That nuance is often lost in viral conversation. Reflection becomes accusation, processing becomes proof, and a personal decision becomes a public verdict. At the same time, Aaron's continued quiet added to the imbalance. With one side explaining and the other not responding, audiences naturally gravitated toward the voice that was present. Silence from the other side was interpreted, fairly or not, as absence from the story. That dynamic gave Teyana's framing more weight, even though she did not ask for it. By the end of this phase, the story was no longer just about a breakup. It was about who controlled the narrative and how easily a relationship can be redefined once one person explains their leaving. The betrayal, real or perceived, became the lens through which everything else was viewed. And once that lens exists, it is difficult to remove. Once Teyana's explanation entered the public space, the story accelerated in a very specific way. Media outlets didn't focus on what was unknown, they focused on what felt definitive. Headlines highlighted the idea of betrayal because betrayal is emotionally efficient. It gives audiences a clean frame to understand a complicated ending, even when the details remain unclear. In that translation, nuance was the first thing to disappear. The internet responded exactly as it often does when emotional language meets ambiguity. People stopped asking what Teyana actually said and started debating what she must have meant. Clips were shortened, quotes were isolated. Context was stripped away in favor of impact. What had been described as realization and misalignment quickly became framed as deception and wrongdoing, not because evidence emerged, but because interpretation hardened through repetition. Audience psychology played a major role here. Many listeners projected their own experiences onto the story. If they had been hurt quietly in past relationships, they heard themselves in Teyana's words. That identification created certainty. When people feel represented, they stop questioning. The story becomes personal, and personal stories rarely leave room for doubt. Empathy blended with assumption, and assumption began to feel like fact. At the same time, silence from Pierre allowed the imbalance to grow. In public narratives, the side that speaks defines the emotional tone. The side that does not speak becomes whatever the audience needs them to be to complete the story. For some, that meant guilt. For others, it meant restraint. Either way, his absence was used to reinforce conclusions that were never confirmed. Reaction culture amplified the escalation. Commentary channels framed the situation as a reveal rather than a reflection, because reveals perform better. The more confident the interpretation sounded, the more it spread. Caution did not travel as far as certainty. Over time, confident speculation became the dominant version of events, even among people who admitted they did not know the full story. Another reason the betrayal narrative escalated so quickly is because it offers closure. Breakups without clear reasons feel unfinished. Audiences dislike unfinished stories. Betrayal gives an ending that feels complete. It answers the why without requiring evidence. That emotional satisfaction makes the narrative sticky, even when it oversimplifies reality. What often goes unacknowledged is that public explanations are rarely comprehensive. They are fragments of a larger private experience. When fragments are treated as full accounts, distortion becomes inevitable. Teyana's words were not meant to be an investigation. They were an explanation of her choice. But once media and audiences treated them as proof, the story shifted from understanding to judgment. By this point, the relationship itself had almost disappeared from focus. What remained was a storyline about trust, betrayal, and hindsight. That storyline no longer depended on new information. It sustained itself through belief. And belief, once established, is far more resistant to correction than rumor. This is the stage where narratives stop evolving and start settling. The escalation slows, but the frame remains. The next phase isn't louder, it's quieter. It's about how these stories live on after the conversation fades, shaping perception long after people stop actively talking about them. After the intensity faded, the story didn't disappear. It settled into memory. This is the stage where public narratives stop trending but start shaping how people remember what happened. For Teyana Taylor, speaking once and then returning to silence locked her explanation in place. For Pierre, continued quiet allowed that explanation to stand without counterweight. Silence, whether intentional or not, became part of the structure of the story. What makes betrayal narratives so durable is that they don't rely on proof, they rely on emotional logic. Once people accept the idea that someone felt betrayed, they assume there must have been something concrete to justify that feeling. Over time, the feeling becomes treated as evidence. Even without details, the narrative hardens because it satisfies the audience's need for cause and effect. As weeks pass, perception begins to outweigh reality. Interviews are rewatched with new suspicion. Old photos feel differently charged. Neutral moments get reinterpreted through hindsight. None of this confirms anything, but confirmation stops mattering once the frame is set. The story becomes less about what actually happened and more about what people believe must have happened. Another consequence of this phase is narrative imbalance. The person who explains their leaving is often granted emotional authority. The person who does not respond is left to be interpreted. That imbalance fuels judgment, even when silence is simply a boundary. Public culture often treats explanation as honesty and privacy as evasion, even though both can coexist without wrongdoing. Media repetition reinforces this quietly. Periodic references, recap articles, and commentary revisits keep the betrayal frame alive without adding substance. Each repetition strengthens association, making it harder to separate interpretation from fact. Over time, the audience stops asking questions because the story feels settled. This is also where personal identity becomes tied to narrative. The relationship is remembered not for its complexity, but for its ending. One person becomes associated with realization and strength. The other becomes associated with ambiguity. These associations linger long after both people have moved on privately. By now, the conversation no longer needs new fuel. It has already found a place to rest in public memory. That is the quiet danger of implication. It doesn't explode, it embeds. And once embedded, it changes how future moments are interpreted, even when they have nothing to do with the past. The next and final phase isn't about speculation anymore. It's about responsibility, how audiences, media, and commentary culture decide when a story deserves to end, and whether silence should be respected instead of filled. By the time the conversation slowed, the story had already done its work. What began as Teyana Taylor explaining why she chose to leave had transformed into a public narrative about betrayal, even though no concrete act was ever laid out. That transformation didn't happen because of facts. It happened because interpretation filled the silence faster than truth ever could. This is the uncomfortable reality of modern celebrity culture. When someone finally speaks after a breakup, the audience doesn't just listen. They decide. They assign meaning, intention, and guilt based on fragments. Reflection becomes accusation. Processing becomes proof. And a personal decision becomes a public verdict that follows both people long after the relationship itself is over. For Pierre, silence became the loudest response without him ever choosing it to be. In public storytelling, the person who explains controls the emotional tone, while the person who stays quiet becomes whatever the audience needs to complete the narrative. That imbalance is rarely fair, but it is common. Privacy is often punished when curiosity has already been activated. What's most revealing here isn't what was said, but how quickly certainty replaced curiosity. Very few people asked what they didn't know. Most decided what they believed. That shift tells us more about the audience than about the relationship. We want closure. We want clean endings. And betrayal offers a simple explanation for complex emotional realities, even when it oversimplifies the truth. This story was never really about a shocking reveal. It was about boundaries. About how much explanation public figures owe for private decisions, about whether silence should be respected or treated as suspicious, and about how easily we confuse emotional resonance with factual accuracy. So here's the question worth leaving open. When someone explains why they left without details, do we listen, or do we rewrite the story to satisfy our need for drama? When the other person stays quiet, do we honor that choice, or do we fill the silence with assumptions? And at what point does commentary stop being analysis and start becoming erosion? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who believes every breakup has a villain. And remember this the next time a personal story turns into public content. Not every ending needs a label, and not every silence needs to be explained.